Thank you for joining the 8-week digital series today. My name is Matt Palakdary, and I will be your moderator again this week. We have a very special guest in Dr. Elouise Epstein from Kearney, who has some views for us today that are very progressive. I love hearing Dr. Elouise speak because you get a view into the landscape of where technology sits today and where it is headed into in the future. So with that, Dr. Elouise, we'll pass it over to you, and we'll gather questions for the end.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And thank you to Teal Book for hosting this. This is exciting. For those that don't know me, I'm a vice president with Kearney. I'm based out of San Francisco. I've been with the firm almost 20 years, 20 years in June. In consulting, that makes me an old timer. And I do digital procurement strategies for companies. And I help companies bridge where they are today and get them to the future. In addition to being in doing my day job, I am on ISM's Thought Leadership Council with Stephanie and a bunch of other forward-thinking leaders. And I'm also on the Procurement Foundry's board, advisory board, and I'll talk about Procurement Foundry later because that's an interesting development. And for those that are interested, we will be talking maybe hopefully not too much about politics. We'll see. But what we will, like there are a lot of economic issues, and in a couple of weeks, I'll be interviewing an economist, and we'll be discussing these macro trends from both a historical and a economic point of view. The content I'm going to discuss today stems from a series of white papers that I co-authored with a partner out of our London office, all about the future of procurement. This is content that was developed with clients. There's nothing worse than a bunch of consultants sitting around a room trying to figure out the future. It's truly dreadful. So so these are clients that we've worked with and that are really pushing the boundaries of what's possible in procurement. And so we've codified it, put it out there, and it's now included in a book that will drop in May, and you can see that there. If you want a copy of the book, just reach out to me on LinkedIn or after this, and I'm happy to send you a copy. And the book is more broadly about disruptive procurement, and this future of procurement is part of this. Like everybody, I guess I need to talk about what we're learning from the COVID crisis. And I think first of all, we won't know. We won't know until economists, political scientists, and most importantly, historians study this a year from now, a year after it ends, 5 years after it ends, 10 years after it ends, 20 years after it ends. I have a feeling, given how traumatic and dramatic it is, it may take 20, 30, 40, 50 years before we fully understand this. However, there are a few lessons that are already emerging, and I'm going to talk about a few of those just to set the context of my broader talk. And certainly one is the importance of signaling, and the others are the limits of capitalism. I think when we are at a juncture at least in America, where the federal government is abdicating its role, and that's neither a positive or a negative statement. You can make your own determination, but I'm going to put that in context here. And the third one is procurement people are awesome. So I think we're if you look at what Teal Book and a lot of the other vendors are doing, they are opening up and collaborating and trying to solve this crisis, whether it's finding suppliers or helping with exchanges to match supply and demand of N95 masks or whatever it is. Procurement's really stepping up to the challenge, and it's great to see. And so and I also have a challenge at the end. So if you all hang in until the end and I haven't put you to sleep, I do have a challenge. I have the next challenge for all of us, and I have a specific ask on what we need to do, what the next thing is once we move beyond masks and ventilators and those pieces. And you know, the one benefit or to a crisis like this is when we have virtual Thanksgiving with our families, instead of discussing politics, our families will largely understand what it is we do. I think most people now have a much greater appreciation of supply chains and procurement, sadly. Now, I used to start with a talk about, you know, how global markets are being disrupted by macro forces. This slide's pretty much irrelevant, so I'm going to, you know, dump that. And of course, it would be obvious to, you know, start with a slide that, you know, kind of shows, you know, pandemics over the last 200 years, or that Bill Gates did a TED Talk in 2015. You know, you know, as an example of signals that we missed, because that would be too obvious. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to pick a different crisis and show how we didn't read the risk signals clearly. So if we go back to 9/11, and one of the most traumatic, you know, events in America's history. Okay, well, I spoke to these, so there was nothing to see there. This is the slide that I used to show, and it's, you know, it's pointless anymore. And then this was the joke, for those that missed it. You know, why would I? You know, I'm not going to be so obvious as to show, you know, the pandemics over the last 200 years, or that Bill Gates actually, you know, told us we weren't ready, because that would be too obvious. So actually, let's go back to 9/11, right? And the importance of signaling and taking action. And a lot of our quote unquote, at least America's politicians, came out of that thinking, how could, you know, how could we not see this? How do we not understand? And if you actually go back and read the 9/11 Commission report, which it's pretty compelling reading, but it's really dense, and it's congressional testimony. But you start to learn that actually the idea of hijacking a plane and flying it and using it as a bomb actually traces its antecedents back to, first off, a Tom Clancy novel in 1994, where that is one of the plot devices. But actually, in 1974, a gentleman named Samuel Bick attempted to hijack a plane and fly it into the White House to assassinate then President Richard Nixon. And so these signals are out there, right? And we're not collectively doing a good job of reading them, and more importantly, taking action on them. And that's important as we think about the risk modeling tools that we have. And perhaps the other lesson is we need to start having historians work on our risk modeling. That's a different issue. And of course, we're living in unprecedented times, but I want to take you back to World War One, and I'm sure everybody's at this moment thinking, oh my God, how do we jump into the history? Where are we going with this? But trust me, we'll get there. But if you think about World War One, what would the ideology that we think about as we think about soldiers in trenches, and, you know, this very bloody warfare where you know, the soldiers are running across no man's land and getting cut down. But if you actually look at what World War One was, it was the first industrial war. It was the first total war where all of, you know, every nation's you know, resources were brought to bear. And it's the first industrial war. Well, it's also the first three-dimensional war, where we have land, air, and sea battles. And when you combine all of that, it's an industrial war. And it's one, and then, you know, as all of us that do logistics understand, no gas, no rubber, no metal, no iron, you name it, the commodities that go to fund and then build the machines of war and operate the machines of war really become a differentiator. Which is funny, because when America enters the war, the US Army and the Navy look a lot like this. And the question is how do we get from a you know, a bathtub Navy and you know, some folks out on the range, And it's because we did this massive mobilization. It's a federal mobilization. And you can, because we had all these individual states, we're about 37 years removed from the Civil War, the American Civil War, the one that ended in 1865, just in case anybody wasn't clear on that. And so you have all of these, these federal boards to manage these resources, to manage these industrial resources. And so I use that as a juxtaposition of where we are today. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. You can make that determination. But we're fighting a crisis that requires massive mobilization. And when individual states are competing with one another and they're on their own, quote unquote, we're not marshaling our resources effectively. And maybe that's okay, because maybe that's an opportunity for us as procurement professionals and supply chain professionals. Maybe that's our ability to fill that breach. Maybe not. Again, we'll debate this for the next 50 years. So with that in mind, now I want to start to look towards the future, because as we look at at the COVID crisis and what's coming out of this, the one takeaway, well, there's a lot of takeaways, and I'm going to start layering them in. We are so fixated on tactical procurement, we're so fixated on operational procurement that we are unable to prepare for crises effectively. I think that's becoming clear. And as we are unable to do that, because we were running around doing procurement requests, we have buying desks, we're dealing with complicated processes, which I'll deconstruct in a moment. And regardless of all of that, regardless of COVID, we have to get better, and we have to get to the strategic stuff. COVID's just going to accelerate that. We need to get to the strategic stuff now. And there's measures on efficiency, effectiveness, experience. You can read those later. I think that's obvious. But when we look at our traditional procurement process, it's very linear and it's very rigid. And this is completely and wholly inadequate to support the digital revolution and to manage a crisis like COVID. Because the moment something like COVID hits, this entire process breaks down. And when Tealbook and Resolink and Cievo and all the other vendors are offering their services, it's because the fundamental processes underpinning our procurement are outdated, totally inflexible, and just flat out wrong. And I would add one more commentary here that's beyond digital, is this idea of directs and indirects. That's another casualty of COVID, because we can't think like that, because and tiering our suppliers is also going to change over the next few years, because yes, you have materials and commodities that go into manufacturing your product. But guess what? If you don't have hand sanitizer or janitorial services, your factory is going to be shut down. So all of a sudden, ancillary indirect categories that didn't take very much attention beforehand, all of a sudden become very, very important. And so whereas in the past we might have done tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and tier N segmentation, we need to rethink that a little bit, because we need to look at our suppliers holistically and with a lot more attention to detail. Doesn't mean we do a lot of strategic stuff necessarily with them, but we also need to get smarter about that. And because we have digital tools, and this is sort of the transition, we can actually look at our supply base much more granularly and without a lot of human intervention. Which then, of course, leads me to the problem with today's technology. And because the technology that underpins that broken process is poorly adopted. It's poorly designed, it's poorly adopted, and each of these Harvey balls on here show various degrees of immaturity. And after 20 years, there's no full Harvey balls. And some of these are actually regressing. Up until January, I started to, I talk to clients every week. I'm surprised at how few clients, or the number of clients that don't have spend visibility is going backwards. Like, how is that happening? And sourcing, like the amount of coverage and velocity in sourcing is still not where it needs to be. And on and on and around this, and I can spend an hour on this slide, and I promised Matt I wouldn't do that. But but essentially, what the takeaway is, there's no single source of truth. It's inefficient. There's inability um, to give good user experiences to our different user personas. And the takeaway here is that we need better technology. And it's not that the technology doesn't exist; it actually does exist, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. Is the reason things are so challenging is because for the last 20 years, we've purchased solutions, these suite solutions that were built on the previous processes. So the last two slides were anchored across this idea of supplier management, sourcing, contract management, risk, so on and so forth. And that's the first thing that has proven to be inefficient, as well as if you are looking to buy a suite today, first of all, don't. Second of all, or at least don't sign a 5-year contract. Second of all, if you evaluate all the vendors across these dimensions, they're roughly the same. It doesn't really matter who you pick. And my argument is going to be, just to foreshadow, is that this is the wrong criteria. So if you are looking at evaluation criteria based on these dimensions, it's inaccurate and it's insufficient for the future. And even so, if you're going to more to the point, if you're going to market and you are doing it based on these criteria, it's also insufficient. And if a consultant does it, there's no excuse, because then you've hired the wrong consultant. So what's happened, so we have these big six, and by the way, the big six are going to be the big four, I think, over the next couple of years, maybe even fewer, because the business model is changing, as is the technology architecture, which you'll see. Because there used to be the big seven with MTORIS there, and MTORIS went out of business, and I don't think the market's big enough to sustain six. I don't think it's big enough to sustain four in this current model. And at the same time, there's been an explosion of new technology and new startups, and Tealbook is a perfect example. And I track the startups in this space. I'm tracking 96 startups and over $1 billion in venture capital funding. And that $1 billion doesn't include Scout's 540 million transaction. And what that's telling us is that the big six and just buying a single closed loop suite system isn't good enough. And the problems that emerge out of that, there's a lot of value. And there, in fact, there's tons of value to go after. And those of you that are Tealbook customers know this. Those of you that use any of these others, in essence, there is just a burgeoning industry of procurement-related startups. I'm not even talking about supply chain startups. That's a whole even bigger, more complex market. So this is driving a lot of the change. So this is my new approach to procurement, and I'll just walk you through this. I know, and I'm really skeptical of consultants that use charts like this, but I think it's important because it sets up what's coming. And at the top, which is not in the red, and so if you look at strategy and procurement, these are the business drivers. This is what the board says, this is what the CEO says, this is what we're going to do as a company. These are the markets we're going to compete in, business opportunities, so forth. So on the right, the procurement, CPO, that's how we organize our groups. And that's basically our op model. Underpinning that is an entire ecosystem. And, we can debate the individual pieces of it. And some of these will look familiar, right? We have to have a capability of requisition. We have to have suppliers and markets and networks. We have to have insights and forecasts. We have to do settlement and clearing, and the demand and supply matching is sort of the new evolution of sourcing, right? We have supply and demand and pricing and the economies around that. I'll talk about the community later, but essentially we need to start thinking about collaboration outside the four walls. So let's talk about the ecosystem. So this, to me, is what the future of procurement technology looks like. And actually, it's already emerging. Like I've been sort of giving variations of this talk for the last 18 months, and it changes every week even. And now I can already see, I can see quantifiable evidence, which I'll be writing about here in the next few weeks, about how this architecture is finally coming to pass. And it's not because I'm some brilliant person that came up with this. It's because I just adapted the Salesforce model. This is what's happened on the commercial side of the business. This is what has to happen on the operations side of the business, and where we, how we manage the external spend. And so the takeaway, well, there's a lot of takeaways here, but the first one is you need to use these best of breeds. And because it's not because you need a whole bunch of tools, it's actually because you need to get very precise in the capabilities you need to do. One sourcing tool is totally and wholly inadequate to do sourcing. To get 95% of your spend through through a single tool is impossible. There's too much nuance, there's too much variance, there's too many consultants coming up with new ideas that one tool is inadequate. So you need, I would argue, four, and maybe next year, a year from now, you might need 6 tools in sourcing. That's how sophisticated it's becoming. Analytics is one thing. There's category solutions, and so the big push has to be around this hub platform. Call it an exchange, call it the Salesforce or procurement, whatever you want. That's what's going to make this work. For those of you who are wondering, that we can have a discussion about how to deal with CIO. But the CIO has seen this before. They've seen it on the commercial side. They've seen it in some industries. When I do work with banking and high tech, and they understand this. This is not new for them. This is new for procurement. And so the push is and the real question is, who's going to be the hub? Who's going to be the platform? And I would say that's emerging. I'm not going to, tip my hand as to, because nobody has established that space, but I think there are good entrants, and they're logical people that can fill that space. Certainly the big 6 have the opportunity. I think most of them are going to stumble and trip and not make use of that opportunity. I think the Salesforces of the world, I think the Amazons have a chance, but there's no indication that they do want to do that. Workday certainly would be an option. And then I would also put it out there that I think there are at least one startup that maybe a couple that may flex their muscles, might be partner, might move to that center and be that center piece. And so if we, since we're going to be going down this path, then we need a new evaluation criteria. Oh, by the way, just a couple things. On this slide, these are just illustrative, and the number of logos changes all the time. I'm adding them, subtracting them. People move all over the place as acquisitions come, as they come and go. This is just meant, the takeaway from this slide is the complexity and the nuance. It's not that I'm advocating anybody on this slide. And if you happen to be a vendor and you're not on the slide, you're welcome to follow up with me afterwards, and I can add you to the site. It's not a scientific process. But what is a scientific process is the new criteria we need to evaluate vendors. So I don't care if it's the big 6 or the startups, we need to evaluate them across these dimensions: user experience, quality of data, analytics, automation capability, the ability to do best of breed, and the ability to grow the business. And that gets back to that strategic option of where we're going to go in the future around doing more strategic procurement, not tactical procurement. So if we reshift the criteria based on these dimensions, then you can see exactly how poor the big 6 play, at least today. And so it just becomes a stark contrast, because when we were using the old evaluation criteria, it was a little like, oh, well, you have best of breeds good at this, capability A, but oh, we have the whole closed loop system. So it kind of gave you a sense of comfort, a false sense of comfort. Here, though, when we reset the dimensions, it completely shows exactly how big, how the big 6, their house is on fire. And to be fair, if you watch Ariba Live, and I watched it several times and took copious notes, and then I think what I expect Coupa to talk about in their upcoming event at least I'm hopeful, I should say. I don't have any inside information on anybody. So, so I think those two, to be fair, are shifting. I think the other four, you can really see the disparity between the two. And so what I would encourage you to do is, and you can imagine, and I'm sure you can imagine that I can spend an hour on each one of these topics, right? And break them down. And I'm happy to do another session, or, follow up. But the point is, you need to start thinking about, these are the dimensions to evaluate the vendors, because it's what are you doing to create value, and how are you creating? Because the implicit assumption used to be, well, we bought the closed loop system, that's the value. The value is going to come. But guess what? The value never came. We built business cases that the value never came. All these vendors put out business cases that the value never came. My competitors did the same thing. We all are guilty of the same thing. And what's happened is we have basically a landscape of broken technology that never met its expectations. So this is why it's so important to use this criteria. So then, how do we do this? Because I'm very anchored in the how. You have systems in place. I know everybody, I'm not saying rip out your system. If you are evaluating systems in the market, there are different strategies for doing that. And if you're, coming up to the, 2 years left on a contract, now is the time to start thinking about this. But regardless of where you are on your journey, today there are opportunities. You can layer in any one of those technologies, those discrete technologies, and create value. Period. End of sentence. Now, you might have opportunities in sourcing, you might have opportunities in payment, you might have opportunities, across the whole value chain. Doesn't matter. Just pick a couple and go after them. And I'll talk about that in a second. And over the next couple of years, you also need to start building your data lake, and you need to start getting really this idea of connected applications in a way, and you can start to see that this is the beginning of the hub, where we start to plug in and actually make these, they do the connections between these individual solutions. And let me just make one commentary, one editorial. When I talk about integration, I mean the vendors integrate with one another using sophisticated APIs, not they charge you as the client or the customer, and you pay for the integration. That's intellectually dishonest, and there's been too much of that over the last 20 years. So in Salesforce, if you go out to Salesforce and you go out to the market, you just point click and onboard your new app, whatever app it is. And this is the same thing here. Salesforce doesn't charge you to use vertical response or to do the integration. So in this middle bucket, it's starting to get your head around and start to work on the integrations there, and really testing these out and working through, because you can imagine there's a lot of processes and that have to change, and your entire op model has to change. And then in the future state, then you really get to this very agile, if I can use the term, and very sophisticated way of operating, where you have not only individual applications, but even micro applications, where you might do something very, very small on data exchange, or on payments, or on supplier enhancement or enrichment. So this is kind of what your roadmap looks like. And this is the important piece, is this roadmap enables you to go from what we are today. And what we are today is buyers, category experts, quote unquote, analysts, supply managers, and we have one metric, savings. And we need to move to value generators, total value generators, cross-category solutions, real-time insights. And I think COVID, and I set up here really gets at that, cross value chain orchestration. So it's not just about getting cost savings, right, on what was coming, is working upstream in the demand forecasting, in the NPI, the new product introduction, moving up, doing design to source, and then moving to balanced scorecards, which is, is not a single metric of cost, because arguably with this new technology, I can get you the annual 10% savings through automation. Like that's one of the key takeaways is I can get 10% cost savings through automation. So then what's everybody else going to do? So that's the question. And that's when we start to actually create value. And there's all kinds of examples of creating value over and above just simple cost savings. And then I'll wrap up here with two things. One is, as I talked about this community and just collaborating beyond the four walls. And I think there's going to see a lot of examples of this, but part of this is generational. We're with the emergence of millennials, and forgive me for being, generational. Boomers were very, command and control. Do not share anything with anybody. Millennials will share, and I apologize to all the millennials, share anything with anybody. And I actually think that's a good thing. And those of us that are Gen Xers, we're in the middle, and we're trying to figure out if we should not share or we should share. So we're just kind of a little schizophrenic in the middle. But what we're seeing out of this COVID crisis is this ability and willingness to share and to step out and say, hey, even if we're in competitive industries, the world's collapsing around us. How about we work together a little bit? And when the crisis is over, we'll see this with corporate social responsibility. We're already seeing this in, the companies are sharing resources and sending resources, to do these sort of, temporary assignments so that the individuals and the organizations learn from each other. By putting boots on the ground and sharing, and it is very successful. And you're even seeing the reemergence, I'll say, of group purchasing organizations where a bunch of companies come together. There's a question about the viability, but I'll just, show you an example of, like this is from Procurement Foundry, but you're seeing a lot of this because I didn't want to highlight any particular vendor, and this is the community. But if you actually look at the exchange here, there were a lot of exchanges about, N95 masks on where to get them and who has extra and redistributing them. And there was a lot of examples of this. And when I saw this and I show this to people, that really talks about the power of the community. And one vendor can't build the community, right? The community is all of us, and it's how we do this. Because I'm getting towards the end of time, and I promised Matt I would not go wildly over, although we'll see. These are my 4 takeaways, and probably I'm going to go in reverse order. The first one is obvious, right? Change the way you evaluate your digital systems. I talked about that. Put the R in SRM. And I think that's the relationship, right? How many, suppliers did we just beat on for cost savings? And I'm not even saying, consultants are guilty of this. So I'm not putting this on necessarily individuals. This is a collective problem. But guess what happens when in the midst of a crisis, and you just beat your supplier that does hand sanitizer for a few nickels? And now it's holding up your production of whatever, and your supplier's like, well, I've got these people over here, I have a relationship with them, and I'm going to give them the few bits of hand sanitizer that I have, or as it comes off, it's going to them, not you, because you didn't really treat me like an equal, like a partner, or even like a normal business. So I think we really are going to need to focus on putting the R in SRM. And then how you can help. I think as we get enough masks and ventilators and all of that sorted out, guess what's going to come next? The economic collapse. And the economic collapse is going to come on a number of fronts. But one of the fronts that we as procurement are going to be at the epicenter of is all these contracts and the suppliers and the payment terms and all these clauses. And so how are we going to put, are we going to, especially for small and mid-sized businesses, are we going to, if you have about 10,000 suppliers, how many are SMBs? And how are you going to put them all out of business? Because that's where the real impact of one of the impacts of the economy are going to be, is, what can we do to have flexibility? And should we really execute the force majeure clause? And maybe going forward, we need, and I took this from Mike Cadeau, but maybe we need the Mad Max Thunderdome clause, which is not executing force majeure, but it's actually a trigger in the contract that if everything collapses, we renegotiate the terms on a temporary basis. And so we need to get more sophisticated in how we think about the execution, the payments, and how we react to what the financial crisis that's coming. And again, if you think back to our traditional procurement upstream, downstream process, that's inadequate for these flexible payment terms, these flexible breaking up in the contracts and rethinking that. And I'm not saying I have the answer. I would put it out there to the community. I've asked Procurement Foundry, and I've like, you've got to do this, to host some dialogues on this, because I think it's going to require all of us to put our heads together and figure this out. And then my last point, what's the next massive disruption? And are we listening? Because it's easy to look at the pandemic, and in 6 months we'll be very focused on pandemics. But there are undoubtedly, we've seen a rise in earthquakes, we've seen a rise in fires, we've seen a rise in tsunamis, and we've also seen a rise in cyber attacks. And so if I, as a futurist, I am putting my focus on cyber, because I think we could get a massive disruption in cyber. And think about all of the adjustments we've made in this current pandemic, and think about what would happen if all of a sudden half or 2/3 of the infrastructure, even a third of the infrastructure went down. We wouldn't be doing all these Zoom virtual meetings. And we would have serious communication issues. So while maybe hopefully will never happen, we need to start thinking about these types of scenarios just to sort of play it out, because we can't take anything for granted. So my last slide, in 30 seconds or less, the opportunity is now. We're in a great time to be in procurement. Procurements, I find that, I've been in this industry for 20 years. I love it. And the innovation that's happening, the networking that's happening, the energy, the innovation. Look around. Well, if we're in a room, I'd say look around, because we're all connected to one another, and we're all, not only are we in this crisis together, which is sort of making that abundantly clear, but we're in this industry together. And I think a lot of us chose to be in this, especially the younger folks, and we love it, and we stay because we love it. And so I would encourage you to take that momentum and get through the crisis. Let's all get through the crisis, and then let's go out and make procurement the organization we want it to be. So with that, I'm almost on time. So as I promised, Matt. So I'm happy to take some questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Epstein. That was fantastic. As you can imagine, based on your presentation here, you got flooded with questions, and I think we probably have time for 4 of them. So
Okay.
I've picked out a couple here to ask, and I'm going to ask the first one because it did shout out Tealbook a little bit, so I want to ask that. But thank you, Susan. It says, do you think a lot of the problems with the big 6 and startups, except Tealbook, fail to focus enough on quality data?
Yeah, I think quality data has been the Achilles heel, but I also think it's become an excuse. I have a slide that I cut for time, but that really talks about, we're in the era of no excuses. You have no excuse for bad data. And I'm not a homer for Tealbook. I admire every startup for their strengths and weaknesses. And I always, and you can go back to the tape, I always use Tealbook as an example, even when I'm presenting at other conferences. Tealbook's an example of where you can take dirty data and very quickly transform it into good data. And there are spend companies that do that for spend analytics. So there's no excuse. There's no excuse for bad data. And even if you can go around, like we can go through the entire procurement value chain on the data that gets generated. Historically, yes, but going forward, when you see something like Tealbook or something like the spend vendors or something like, like there's others that do, market intelligence. When you see the data that gets generated, there's no excuse. And we can even we live in an era where teardown labs are increasingly common. So I can take any product, I can take these headphones here, take them to a teardown lab, break down every component in them and do a cost analysis on them. I don't have to see the spec of those headphones to know what they should cost. If I can go take the headphones to or any product to a teardown lab and do a cost breakdown, then what's the excuse for bad data? There's no excuse. If I can give you my vendor master and Tealbook can master it in I say 24 hours. I'm sure that's nowhere near accurate, but in a few days, then Stephanie's cringing, I can tell. But if you can do it and turn it around in a couple of days, that's like breakthrough, and that's why I use that example, because we're beyond the era of excuses, because people are showing us, vendors are showing us the way. And I'll just say one more thing, because this is a hot the big six promised this and they failed to deliver. And then they told you, they sort of did this gaslighting thing. I'm not saying they gaslit us, but they did, oh, well, you're doing it wrong, or you need to integrate all your ERP systems first, and you need to do all this first. No, like that's not true. And we've seen the way. Hopefully that got to the question, the answer.
Well, yeah, that was a fantastic answer. So we have three
I'm
more
long-winded.
here. No, we have three more, and please answer them. We have the time, so we can give thorough answers if you like the questions. This question says, your slides seem to convey that a best in breed approach is the way to go. How do you approach this discussion with IT in more detail?
So I get this question almost every day, and I love it. Well, first of all, IT people tend not to care for me. They're not my friends. But what you'll find, there's a few arguments. First off, IT always says, well, show me the value. If there's no value, like what's the business case for doing this, right? Which is a completely lazy approach. Because if you go back to my spider chart, I can give you a whole lot of value on each one of those vendors. So building the business case is simple. So to put that up as a roadblock is silly. I censored myself politically there. But it's a silly approach, right? Because if we are managing our external spend, not only can we create massive savings very quickly, we can also, and it gets back to these corporate board strategies, we can enter new markets, we can create value on corporate social responsibility, we can create value. So it's not, so don't pin me into a big six provider just because it makes your life in IT better. More forward-thinking CIOs actually see this, right? Like I presented a couple months ago before the quarantine, and the CIO was in the room, and for a good chunk of the slides that you saw, I was like directing them at him just to see how he'd react, and he was totally nonplussed, and he's like, yeah, no big deal. Now you as a procurement, he put it right back on procurement and said, you as a procurement need to understand how you onboard, offboard tools and how you evaluate them. And I'll pick up that on a second. So I think there is a piece around that, that if you have a forward-looking CIO or one that's willing to partner. But another element of this is that procurement needs to ask IT for what they need, not wait for IT to tell them. And I'll use this very specific example. Every IT organization has a data lake. They invested in data lakes 10 years ago when big data was a thing. And so everybody has a data lake. What we don't have is procurement data lakes. And it's not because they don't exist or they're not necessary. It's because we as procurement have never articulated what we need in a procurement data lake. One of my white papers is exactly focused on that topic. And so part of our best of breeds kind of do feed into this data lake concept. So it's a matter, in some cases, it's a matter of just articulating what we want and what we need and letting them solve it versus saying, hey, we want these 30 vendors, because that can be an overwhelming conversation. And then when in doubt, then take it up, at not you necessarily, but then it becomes a board level or an executive C level rather discussion, and we do lots of top down interventions, and our competitors do too, and that's one of the things, because if you, and I think we'll have a lot of business cases coming out of this crisis, because the fact that we can't keep our factories moving because we don't have this, or because we can't get supplier, we don't understand like we don't have insight into the various cost drivers, or if the price of oil is crashing right now, what's impact on our business? Those are C-level, board level issues that transcend the CIO, because ultimately, you can get so there's like 3 or 4 different ways to get around that. I'll just give you one other long-winded response, but also the other way to approach this, and I didn't talk about that because I forgot, but is one of the approaches is also just to set up an MVP factory, a quote unquote MVP factory, where you take a handful of startups and you do run MVPs with them. And you start to build the organizational awareness and prowess to evaluate, possibly onboard, or evaluate, test and learn, and onboard or offboard these technologies. And so that gives an opportunity for IT to work collaboratively. And so we've seen that as a lot of success. And on the spider chart, oftentimes I'll get asked, if I had $1 million, what would I focus on first? And I think that's a useful exercise you can do with IT, which starts them to get them comfortable with this approach. And by the way, they don't complain about Salesforce. So once we have the platform, then they really won't complain about this either.
So we have 2 more questions. One revolves around skill sets. So this says, what skill sets do I need on my team to shift to a best in breed approach that differs from a full suite approach?
Yeah, so this is a big one, because most organizations, typically I go to most organizations, and procurement IT consists of half an FTE focused on managing the Ariba contract. That's not going to get it done. So as we move from operational and tactical and getting rid of these buying desks, and even to some degree getting rid of category managers, which is a whole different articulation. But what we start to get is we need to align around digital operations. We need to align around getting into the product lines, moving procurement upstream into the product lines, and then doing SRM and with really a focus on the R, as I said. And so as you start to break, work and capabilities, those 3 capabilities, that's new and different. And so if you have 100 people, you want a concentration of people in digital operations. And that might be in partnership with IT. That's okay. Like procurement doesn't need to run the data lake. They don't even need to, know what the plumbing is. They just need to be able to articulate and communicate with IT. And oftentimes I speak to IT on behalf of clients to sort of say, hey, look, we need this supplier information, we need this transactional information, we need this benchmark information, so on and so forth. So you need people that want to be in that space. And I don't think that's a problem. It's new, it's exciting. Look at all the examples I've given, in this talk, and there's tons more. Like, if you want to do innovation, there's plenty of innovation to do in the digital, and especially in the product center, the upstream stuff and the product design. So, and there's also innovation to do in the SRM. So what I would say is it's a matter of resetting the talent profiles and getting people organized around that. And so you can imagine that digital is really just the door opener. It is for us, and it's just in general, because it's largely solved, and it's just a matter of executing now. And once that happens, it changes your entire op model, which is a good thing. It's a great thing, because now you can get more flexible processes that can respond to crises. You have a different talent mix. You have a different profile with the senior leadership of the company. It really starts to, that's the whole point, is digital opens all this up, and talent is a critical component. And I would argue you can get the talent now, like, because we hire MBAs out of college. or out of grad school, and like the quality that's coming out is just, I mean, it's scary. And even undergrads in business school and highly motivated folks, there's plenty of good people out there.
Okay, so we have the last question for you today, and this is a question from somebody who already has a full suite provider. So they
Yep.
say, we have a full suite provider today. Is there a hybrid approach that enhances my full suite provider with niche providers as a complement?
Yeah. So I'll give you a generic answer and then a detailed answer. So yes, there, and this gets, I call this layering. And think about the MVP concept. You have your suite, and then you layer in, a handful of these best of breeds, and start working with them and working in conjunction. And if there's no clear integration, I oftentimes see Coupa with iCertis, right? And so the integration is there, no problem. Ariba has certain integrations. So if you go into each of the vendors, there are certain integrations. And then there's some tools, like if you're going to use a market intelligence tool, well, you don't really need to integrate it. So that's what I talk about layering. So you have your suite, and then you have an eye towards when that's going to renew, and you're probably hopefully not going to renew, or at least renew in the current structure. And then you'll do your MVPs, take your $1 million or your 5 MVPs or your factory where you're going to do 20 MVPs and just layer it on. And the reason you do that is because you don't want to force a fight with IT. You want to be able to give them, the opportunity to partner with you, and to not for like if you said I need 5 tools integrated into my suite, well, that's going to kind of kill the whole project because it's going to cost so much overhead to do that. But if you run them in parallel and think about it in layering, with minimal integration, either it exists or it's very light, then you'll get rolling and you'll start to get the benefits. And then once you have the benefits, whether it's 1, 2, or 5 of those MVPs, then you do another 5, and then another 5, and that's how you can get to the future, because you're obviously not going to rip out your suite.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Epstein. I found the conversation very intriguing, especially the pieces at the beginning, and then seeing how you see the technology shifting over time. So I think we've all learned a lot today of how we should be thinking about our technology specifically for the future. For those on the phone, at Tealbook, we are still providing free reports to those who are struggling to get through COVID. So if needed, there's a link on our homepage that you can take advantage of that offering as well. So we want to finish the webinar with that today to make sure that you all know that that is available. And next week, we have Walter Charles coming on to talk about how to take advantage of the future state in today's market.